Are the preparations complete, spindly one? The crow was perched upon the helmet of my armor, and its eyes glowed a faint red as the message burned into my mind. My fury enveloped me. How dare it refer to me as spindly? This entire plan depends entirely upon me. On the other hand, though, my plans depend upon them as well. I carefully hid my bile and rage at the disrespect as I formulated my response. The preparations are moving forward according to the schedule. I grow impatient. We grow impatient. The filth one must be destroyed and our lands must be returned. I couldn't help but sigh. How can one live for thousands of years and still be as impatient as a whining pup? Do elder vampires regress into childhood as they age? Thinking on it, the older people seem to get the less mature they seem to act. Even members of the nobility are no exception. Perhaps maturity follows some sort of bell curve. There is nothing that can be done for your impatience with the exception of the expert application of your own willpower. A shriek blasted in my mind that would have given me a start had I not been fully expecting it. The faint glow of the crow's eyes turned bright as they bored into mine. I met those eyes without blinking, staring down the challenge issued. The vampire controlling the crow knew there was nothing they could do against me. Soon enough, the coloration faded entirely, and I was left glaring at a very confused corvid. Crows are strange birds. In many ways, they seem to be dumber than the birds that are natural to this world, but in some certain specific ways, they're very intelligent. This crow, for instance, knew that it was out of place, but didn't make the type of fuss one would expect a wild animal to. Instead, it watched me warily, staying still and waiting for me to make the first move. It would continue to wait. I had no intention of risking a pecking by trying to pick it up. Thankfully for us both, my tent flap opened and the bird from another world took the chance to escape with gusto. General Smarn cursed as he had to crouch to avoid a collision with it. Once the bird had taken to the sky, Smarn looked at me with an obvious question in his bright orange eyes. "A crow with a message for me from a family member," I explained before he could ask. I shook a freshly unfolded missive that had been attached to the crow's left leg. The point of the missive wasn't actually communication, it was to lend credence to my cover story. After all, it would be suspicious to have random avian visitors for unknown reasons. Its contents were quite benign, and not the type of thing one would waste time on a reply to. "A crow?" he asked. "Your family uses demon spawn to send messages? Talk about a luxury." I cringed inwardly at the general's ignorance of the origin of crows. They may have been introduced to this plane of existence by the demons, but it was not there that they originated. True demon spawn must be crafted and cannot be bred and tamed like crows can. "What is it?" I demanded, neglecting to educate him. "The Northern Legion, He struggled to remember their given name. "The Altris," I reminded him. "Yes, sir. The Altris have at last joined us. They are formed up and waiting orders. 2 more legions to go, then." I sighed. "Have them continue their training. If the commanders protest, have them flogged and brought before me." "Yes, sir." General Smarn bowed and left my tent. I watched the royal green flap close behind him, then turned my attention to the table that my helmet rested upon. Also upon the table was a well-detailed map that demonstrated my tactical prowess. Not that there was anyone in this camp who could even begin to appreciate it. The closest thing they'd ever seen to a tactic was to inadvertently flank an enemy when the rear lines couldn't get to the fight. Amused, I glanced at the missive that had been attached to the crow. "Dearest Kirain, are you safe yet? Esmira. Sent from and signed by my youngest sister, that would be a trick. She's currently bound and gagged. To serve as food, of course. There truly is no blood quite as divine as one's own, but only the blood of others can nourish. As such, having family members is quite a boon. The other vampires were jealous of this, but then they were jealous of a great many things. My position, my manner, my power, and even my mission. To them, a half-breed like myself rising to such a station is abhorrent. To them, one such as I rising so high only serves to demonstrate how low they've fallen. To them, I'm merely an uppity tool, and I've no doubt that some of them plan to assassinate me when they get the chance. But even a half-breed like myself has defenses. It's not as if I asked for this honor either. My mother was insane and desperately hated King Lofen. He had executed her father and forced her to marry his favorite noble. My father, on paper, was a duke and very well off. My mother's father was a count and barely qualified as nobility. Most women of the kingdom would have been honored, but my mother was furious. Not because she loved her father or hated the duke, but because she perceived the king's actions as a slight against her. She openly admitted such to me with pride in her voice. She had readily agreed to the vampires' plots when they approached her. They needed someone in the king's inner circle, and she was able to provide that. This lasted through the birth of my older brother, but then the plot evolved. They wanted a general who could conquer lands and help them secretly build an army. So she laid with an elven vampire that looked somewhat like my father. The result of that coitus was myself, a half-breed vampire, and my father was never any the wiser. When a vampire lays with another vampire, the resulting offspring is a vampire brood, a twisted-looking thing similar in appearance to a common ghoul. It is much stronger than a ghoul and just as smart, but it's much easier to kill than a true vampire. One needs simply to hack it up during the daylight and the sun would do the rest. A brood's regeneration was much slower than even my own, which is already only about half as fast as that of a full vampire. When a vampire lays with a mortal, the result is an abomination like myself, a half-breed as they call it. Half-breeds are more similar to true vampires than the brood are, but aren't as physically strong. We also age, which is damned near blasphemous to those who've lived for thousands of years. How can we truly be vampires if we are shackled by time like the cattle are? Regardless, my mother was more than happy to give birth to me for a chance at revenge. She made certain to take very good care of me and never let a wet nurse anywhere near me. She would jokingly tell the wet nurses that I was a biter. But it wasn't a joke. I needed blood every day at that stage, and every day she would whisper to me what my purpose in life was, as well as what would happen if anyone else found out about it. It gave me nightmares, but I kept it together. Better than she did, at any rate. On my 15th birthday, she snapped and murdered my father and older brother, stabbing them both repeatedly as they slept. The latter was convenient, as his assassination was forthcoming anyway. I inherited his share of the titles and lands, and the inbred bastard ordered me to execute my own mother to demonstrate my loyalty. She smiled at me as I took her head. The hardest part about it was resisting the blood smell. I immediately got rid of most of my newly acquired staff and replaced them with loyal servants who were in the know. The excuse I gave was that the prior staff was unable to prevent the assassination of my father nor my brother, so I could not trust that they had not conspired with my mother. After that, they were grateful to leave the manor alive. My two younger sisters became my primary source of sustenance. "Did you write this?" I jokingly asked the covered cage in the corner of my tent. Not getting a reply, I walked over to the cage and kicked it. A small muffled sound answered me. Esmira, my youngest sibling, bound and gagged with silk, and kept very weak by regular feedings. I would feel sorry for her were she not just as vicious and vindictive as my mother. I remembered my 12th birthday party, where she began to spread rumors that I had sexually assaulted a maid. My crime was that I had hidden her doll for a day 6 months prior. For that, I was imprisoned and beaten severely by my father. When her actions were discovered, she grinned and admitted that she was joking around. Her punishment had simply been a scolding from father. Morn, my other sister, was much better behaved and quite well taken care of back at the manor. She still served as a source of sustenance when Esmira became nearly drained, but she was far more willing to part with her blood so that her older brother could conquer the world. Mother had taken her into our confidence early on in life. Morn detests Esmira, and it was her idea to put Esmira in her current situation to ensure I had a source of blood. Truth be told, the blood isn't a requirement for survival anymore. It was when I was a child, but around my 8th birthday I started to be able to survive on normal foods. That's one of the benefits to being a half-breed. It's much easier to pass as a mortal. However, doing so will lead you to being weaker than the average mortal, and all of the benefits to being half-vampire will quickly diminish. I'd had to starve myself of the blood for years to adequately demonstrate my weakness to King Lofen. The king was fully convinced that I was a pathetic worm by the time my predecessor, who had been old and frail when he'd become a Master General, died. The Master General must be weak and uninspiring, otherwise the people will follow them instead of the inbred bastard king. Nolen will likely order my execution if I'm successful with this invasion, but by then it will be too late. The vampires will have a steady source of mortals to convert and plenty of room to create armies of their own. Nolen will find it much harder to execute me now that I'm feeding again and have my abilities back. The regeneration comes in handy, but I have to be careful about who sees it happen. My ability to vanish has actually saved me from several assassins sent by rival nobles and allowed me to satisfy certain curiosities that I had as a teenager. I've never had a reason to shapeshift into an animal, nor do I frequently partake in hypnosis. You would think that hypnosis would be useful, but it has a limited duration, and the mortal's personality drastically shifts during the process. Since it's nearly impossible to use covertly, it's only useful for preventing an imminent attack against oneself or making someone loopy enough to forget that you fed on them. Since I don't feed on strangers, it's only really useful for the former. But then, I have a sword for that sort of thing. There are other advantages to being a half-breed. Sunlight doesn't injure me at all, though most vampires are able to regenerate fast enough that it doesn't actually harm them. I'm also able to subsist on the blood of other vampires, which is another reason my kind is looked down upon. Vampire blood is not nearly as potent as mortal blood, so this is barely even a benefit. The biggest drawback of being a half-breed is that I cannot make vampires of my own, nor can I create children with mortals to make more half-breeds. I can, however, breed with another vampire to create brood. As such, a brood queen has been promised to me for my part in all this. A vampire criminal whose mind has been completely destroyed. They slice off the top of the skull and replace a good deal of brain matter with metal so that the brain cannot fully regenerate. They incinerate the part of the brain that they remove so that the vampire in question is trapped within their now useless vessel. Completely docile and useful for one thing only. It's a very secretive process, but I was privy to it when they showed me my reward. I had been led down a long, darkened stone hallway into a dungeon that the vampires were currently occupying. I was led past laboratories, kennels, prison cells, and even the brood kings. There were far more brood kings than there were brood queens, which is likely an indication of the crime rate among the vampires. At last, I was shown my prize. I never learned her name, only her beauty. She had been a rather curvaceous elf before becoming a vampire. Long silver hair, alabaster skin free of any blemishes, and green eyes that didn't show even a glimmer of intellect. The lack of intellect is a bit of a turnoff if I'm honest, but utterly necessary for her intended function. Her crime had been the murder of another vampire without just cause. Apparently, her victim had convinced her lover to part ways with her. She had tortured the victim first, cutting into her flesh for days before finally ending her eternity. A vicious streak a mile long, one that hopefully our brood would inherit. I sat down in my orc leather chair as I imagined the army of brood she would sire for me. Perhaps I would use that army to capture more brood queens, and eventually I would subjugate the entirety of the continent. If I were to do that, I'd have to give a lot more thought to governmental structure. I will die of old age eventually, and I will need to have a chain of succession if I'm to conquer the world. Yes, that would show those pompous bastards what a half-breed can do. I met my first vampire just after my mother's death. He had smiled scornfully as he informed me that my true father had been captured and destroyed by King Nolen's forces. He told me that scum like me should be honored to play the part I've been given. Even as he educated me on my abilities and the drawbacks of my form, he made it absolutely clear that he believed me to be nothing more than a mote of dust that would cause their greatest enemy to choke. I despised them. Even the vampires with more agreeable personalities made it clear that they believed me to be trash, despite my necessity to their resurgence. Once that resurgence is complete, they will be unlikely to honor their part of the bargain. But I've taken measures against that particular betrayal. The brood queen will be mine, the night kingdom will be mine, the world will be mine. Sir, General Smarn once again opened the flap of my tent. What is it? The Sim-Valrin have arrived. Excellent. Have them form up and continue their training. If the commanders complain, well, you know what to do by now. I ordered with a dismissive gesture, then grinned. "One more." It had been a few days since we left Kirkina, and the trip had been smooth so far. Nash said that since it's just us guarding the carts, we can't do training. I'm thankful for that, but I think the real reason is because he doesn't want my level to surpass his. He'd been acting a little jealous of how quickly I've been leveling up. Still, it's nice to be able to lay down, put my feet up on the side of the cart, relax, and enjoy the ride without muscle aches. One side of the road was lined with a dense forest, and the other side was a flat plain filled with various wild grasses and flowers. In the morning, the sun rose over the plain, warming us up, and in the afternoon, the trees provided a nice little bit of shade to help cool us off. It was the afternoon now, and I was so relaxed that I was right about to drift off for a nap when a bump in the road sent me floating for a second. I came down hard, and Ares appeared to protect my head, but my armor did little to save my poor back. "Ah," I groaned. "Sorry about that," Imlor said. "Not your fault, Imlor." Nash chuckled. "Serves him right for lounging on the job." "Oh, come on," I complained. "You said that these paths are the safe ones." "Relatively safe," Yulk said with a grin. "As in safer than the adventurer paths. It's still more than possible to run into complications out here." "Like what?" I asked. "Monsters for one. Though they're a rare occurrence," Nash chimed in. "Out here, the most common complication is banditry." "Indeed," Yulk agreed. "They don't usually leave survivors either, unless they're hoping for a ransom, of course." "What? Why not? Wouldn't that make the guards come after them?" "Not guards, soldiers. Those soldiers won't deploy until there's a pattern of disappearances, or if there's a report of banditry. So by killing the survivors, they buy themselves some time and the chance to rob more people and go to ground. Plus, if the survivors make it back to town, the soldiers will know what they're dealing with and be better prepared to bring the bandits to justice." Justice. I trialed off, thinking of all the different brands of justice that were used during the medieval times. Back then, more often than not, justice meant death. If you put up a fight, they'd kill you during it. If you surrendered, they'd execute you, usually in pretty nasty ways. It was like all the leaders back then were competing for who could come up with the most disgusting way to end a human life. I don't really know where I stand on the death penalty. I'm sure some of them deserved what they got, but it's easy to take modern justice for granted. "Yeah, justice," Nash repeated. "Can't have them killing honest folk who are just trying to make a living. Too few of them around as it is." Nash's stance on the matter caused the rest of us to fall silent in contemplation. I started running through what-if scenarios in my head to make sense of it all. Another bump in the road interrupted my musing, and I decided to adjust my seating arrangements to prevent further spinal trauma. The carts made their way along the road, the goods in the lead cart making some metallic clanging noises whenever we hit another bump. It sounded somewhat like a silverware drawer, but if the silverware were extra large and heavy. I was nearly about to ask about the contents when Imlor turned to us with a serious expression. "Fire ahead," he said. "Looks like trouble." We scrambled up into better positions to see what he was talking about. Further along the road was a cart on fire and with two of its wheels broken apart, scattered along the road. There was no sign of whatever had been pulling the cart or its owner. As we drew closer, that changed. Over the sound of our carts rolling along, there was a clamor coming from the woods along the side of the road. An arrow sailed from between the trees and Imlor stopped the cart in alarm. I glanced at Nash and Yulk, who were already preparing to exit the cart. I drew my sword as a small man ran out from the tree line. He was in a panic and had a bit of rope tied to one of his wrists. His head turned to look at the flaming cart, and he stopped for a moment. He changed his mind about this pause as another arrow flew in his general direction, and he quickly turned and started running our way. He was so panicked that he ran a good 100 feet or so before he noticed us. All of us, Imlor included, jumped from the cart and started running in his direction. "No!" the man shouted as he continued to run. "Get back!" I paused, but Yulk and Nash continued to chase after Imlor. A few tall orcs exited the tree line as Imlor caught up to the man. I started to run again as my brothers passed Imlor to fight the other orcs. As I caught up to Imlor, I got a good look at both the man and the orcs. The man was wearing fancy clothing, a blue tunic with shiny leather shoes and gold trim on everything. He looked a lot like the guy who was with the High Chief, but his face was different. The rope attached to one of his wrists had an empty loop, and his free hand was bleeding. The orcs looked tough even by orc standards. Covered with little more than pants and scars, they shouted a challenge at my brothers. There was little doubt regarding what was going on. These orcs were bandits, pursuing an escaped kidnapping victim. There was a loud pop as I passed Imlor, and I heard the dwarf shout something from behind me. I turned to look and saw him laying flat on the ground, with Imlor looking down at him with a confused expression. "What's going on?" I shouted. He turned around to say something, but a thunderous sound drowned him out. I felt the weight of Ares appear on my head, and a moment later I was lifted from my feet and sent sailing through the air. My vision went dark for a time, and when it returned, my ears were ringing. I rolled onto my side and tried shaking my head to clear the sound. It didn't work. What the hell was that? An explosion from where? I quickly looked around and saw Imlor helping the dwarf to his feet. Both of them were covered in dust, but Imlor had it all over. He must have been thrown just like me. I glanced at my brothers. Yolk was on the ground and Nash was bent over him. I tried to get up, but my arms felt like jelly. I collapsed back to the ground. I had to see if Yolk is okay. He's gotta be okay. If not, I'll... As I tried to get to my feet again, I felt a hand on my shoulder and looked up to see Imlor. He mouthed something, but my ears were still ringing. I concentrated hard to hear him through the sharp, steady tone. It began to fade, and I was finally able to pick up what he was saying. Nick, are you okay? Can you get up?" he asked, his voice sounding very concerned. I managed to get to my knees and noticed that my right hand was bloody. As I raised it up to look at it, my hand's shadow traveled a bit and I saw the sunlight hit the ground under my hand. Why can I see the ground through my hand? What kind of optical illusion is that? I almost laughed, but then the pain set in. There's a hole in my hand. It's big enough to put my thumb through it. How did that happen? My shoulder hurts too. Is there a hole there? Oh God, my leg is killing me. It's still there, right? Of course it is. I'm sitting on them right now. Don't panic. Calm down. Deep breaths. This isn't so bad. Just wrap it up and 10 will take care of it. Yolk can help? Oh God, Yolk. Are you all right? You're huh? Imlor said. His tone cut right through my concerns like a red-hot meat cleaver through a room-temperature stick of butter. I focused on him with what seemed like tunnel vision and noticed he was holding the upper right side of his stomach. He pulled his hand away and I noticed that the light brown dust had become darker, as if it were wet with something. We both seemed to notice the bright crimson blood on his hand at the same time. "Oh, I'm bleeding too," he said, then looked at me. Our eyes locked and we stared at each other in shock for a full second before I watched his eyes roll into the back of his head. He seemed to fall in slow motion and I tried to catch him, but I was moving even slower. Everything hurt, but I pushed through the pain to stop his head from slamming into the ground. I grit my teeth through the sharp pain as his head connected with my injured hand. But the pain doesn't matter. He needs help. How can I help? What should I do, Yolk? Yolk! I shouted, looking around. Yolk's out cold, Nash shouted back. Imlor's been hurt. Bad. I heard a metallic clang and turned to look at Nash. He was fighting off 2 bandits who had somehow survived the explosion. He was using his 2 swords this time, 1 sword for each bandit. I noted that the remnants of the flaming cart were no longer intact. That must have been where the explosion came from. Feeling numb, I looked back at Imlor. He was pale. Too pale. "Hey boy," someone said. I looked up and saw a dwarf. That's right, he was the one who told us to run and get back. Why didn't we listen? If we had, Imlor would be okay. How do I fix this? This can't be happening. How do I make him okay? What do I do? Here, put this on his wound and push down, the dwarf said, handing me a bundle of cloth. He's out, so don't worry about hurting him. We've got to staunch the bleeding. The cloth was blue with gold trim. It looked familiar. I glanced at the dwarf and noticed he was missing his sleeve. He'd ripped it off, and I was now holding it. I pushed the sleeve against the center of the bloodstain and pushed. Nick, a voice in my head said. I tried to reply, but my mind isn't working right. It feels like I'm swimming without my body. How do I help Imlor? Is Yolk okay? Should I go help Nash against the bandits? I can't. You're adventurers, right? The dwarf asked. I nodded. Adventurers usually travel with a healer. Who's your healer? The bald orc in the robe over there. I gestured with my head. But he's hurt too. The dwarf looked over my shoulder and got a nervous look on his face as he noticed Nash fighting two bandits at once. Nick, Imlor's wound indicates that his liver has been struck with shrapnel. You need to check for an exit wound. How do I do that? I said out loud. Check his back for a similar wound. The dwarf gave me an odd look as I rolled Imlor to check his back. I couldn't see, so I wiped my hand on a clean part of my pants and swiped it across his back. It came back red. Blood. So much blood. He's bleeding in the front and the back. How do I stop the bleeding? I can't push on both sides at once. He's going to die and there's nothing I can do about it. Shit, the dwarf hissed. We need a healer. Ned, he said he was going to spend more time with his family, that he'd retire from the road after this job. This delivery would let him hire on employees to do the majority of the work for him, and he'd finally be able to see his wife and kids more. He'd stop being an absentee father and his kids' lives would be better for it. He's a good person. This isn't fair. Kid, the dwarf said gently, putting his hand on my shoulder. Why did this happen? I don't understand, I said, dimly aware of the tears streaming down my face. My cart had a bunch of mining equipment in it, including explosives, the dwarf said quietly. Those assholes decided that I'd make a good hostage, but my equipment wasn't worth their time, so they torched the cart. Imlor's breathing was shallow. What can I do? Stitches wouldn't work. He'd need surgery to seal up the internal bleeding. A tourniquet? How do you put a tourniquet on a stomach wound? Maybe if we cauterize the wound, but would that just make it worse? If only I could. I don't know if this will work or not, but try casting a healing spell. Imagine the wound healing. That's right. Magic. I felt myself snap back to reality and I spread out my fingers and imagined the wound closing. But that didn't work. My magic core wasn't primed. I took a few deep breaths, and while it was charging, I tried to imagine a liver with a hole in it, then imagining the hole closing and the liver being intact. I closed my eyes to get a better mental picture. Come on. Minor heal unlocked. Le ronim tsak, my mouth said. I felt a tingle as the magic traveled from my chest through my arm and out my fingers. I willed it to continue, pushing all the magic I could into it. I kept charging my magic with deep breaths, refilling my core and mixing the magics even as it was being drained. It somehow felt like sprinting. Is it working? I asked Ten. I can't tell, the clothing is blocking our view of the wound. Lift it up and check. Not yet, I want to make sure. I kept the spell active until I felt the last sputtering of magic flow through my arm. My magic core was fully drained. I felt lightheaded as I lifted his shirt to check his wound. I blinked my eyes heavily a few times as I looked upon his freshly mended skin. There was a slight red mark to indicate where the hole had been. He's healed. The dwarf was surprised. You're a healer? I wasn't a minute ago, I panted, trying not to pass out. I blinked my eyes again and shook my head to stave off the tunnel vision that was forming. Not working. Actually, come to think of it, what are you anyway? He asked. I managed to say before I passed out.